Welcome back to the Divorce Your Remarriage podcast. I'm Chris Iverson, and we're continuing our series where we're reacting to Professor Dr. Benjamin Mays. He's a Missouri Synod Lutheran Seminary professor. He has a book that's coming out about divorce and remarriage. I've pre-ordered his book. I haven't received it yet, but I'm looking forward to getting it, and I'll put a link in the description below so you can see that book and you can order it. And while you're there, you can also order my book. I have a book, Divorce Your Remarriage. It's on Amazon. I'll link to that in the description below. So he was recently on the Javier Perdomo's podcast, which I'll link to in the description, and he was teaching on his view on divorce and remarriage. So we've been reacting to that teaching. In the first episode of this reaction series, we discussed an area where Dr. Mays and I have a lot of agreement, and that is, Jesus taught divorce and remarriage is adultery. And a critical question is, what does somebody do if they're in a remarriage that Jesus called adultery? Now what do you do? And the answer is they need to divorce the adulterous remarriage. I would say every time a remarriage is adultery, that adulterous remarriage must be divorced so long as the prior valid spouse is alive. And Dr. Mays would say that sometimes those need to be divorced. But this is a really important part of agreement that I have with Dr. Mays, because in modern kind of evangelicalism and Protestantism, people have forgotten that that's what Jesus meant, that a remarriage must be divorced. This was the view that Dr. Mays found out after doing some research that was believed historically by Lutherans, actually, that these adulterous remarriages had to be divorced. We also see it with David Brainerd in his diary, and we also see it with the early church, and we also see it with the Anglican, which is a Protestant denomination. This is post-Reformation, also had that view that adulterous remarriages must be divorced. We also see it in the writings of Augustine, for example, who everybody likes. So I'm very grateful that Dr. Mays has this book, and he's sharing his view within the Missouri Synod, and it's reaching people outside of the Lutheran faith so people can understand what Jesus taught on divorce and remarriage in that respect. Adulterous remarriages must be divorced. We covered that in the first episode. In the second episode, we talked about the nature of marriage. And so you can compare and contrast Dr. Mays' views and how he looks at the text and understands them, and then how I look at them and understand them. And then it helps you to be able to understand some of the different perspectives, and you can decide what you think Jesus taught or what was meant by Moses in Genesis 2, for example. Now, in this episode, we're going to discuss a different question. Under what conditions is a remarriage adultery? Right. So there's, one question is, if somebody gets in a remarriage and it's adultery, now what do you do? That's one set of questions. But there's a preceding question that you want to ask, and that is, under what circumstances would a remarriage be adultery? So Dr. Mays and I, for example, we both agree, as does most of Christendom, that if your spouse dies, you can remarry. That's morally permissible. That's fine. We would also agree that if somebody is in an invalid marriage, and then that invalid marriage ends, and then they go marry somebody else, that invalid marriage doesn't prevent them or preclude them from marrying somebody else. So if, for example, if two men got quote unquote married, that's an invalid marriage. If they got divorced, they could marry, either one of them, if they wanted to, could marry a woman, and that would not be adultery against their first spouse, because that was a fake marriage to begin with. Additionally, I would say if somebody was adulterously remarried, so for example, if a man married a divorced woman, and then and her first valid husband is still alive, and then that marriage ends, that man can go marry somebody else, and his marriage to the divorced woman wouldn't preclude him from marrying somebody else, because that first marriage of his was invalid. Or, for example, suppose there was a polygamy situation. So you have a man legally married to two women, let's say. Well, that second marriage is an invalid marriage. It's a fake marriage. It's just continual adultery against the first wife. Or suppose a woman was married to two husbands. It'd be the same situation. So if the second spouse there, that fake spouse, if they divorced, that marriage would not preclude them from marrying somebody else, because that was an invalid marriage. They were never married to begin with. So an invalid marriage doesn't preclude a remarriage. And if a spouse dies, and that prior marriage doesn't preclude a remarriage. But are there any other exceptions? And I would say there are no other exceptions. That's it. So as long as a prior valid spouse is alive, if somebody remarries, it's adultery. And that remarriage would be invalid, fake marriage, and they'd be obligated to divorce that remarriage so long as the prior valid spouse lives. However, Dr. Mays has a different view. He has the kind of typical Protestant view that came, we had it with Luther and we have it with Calvin, and then we saw it in the Westminster Confession of Faith, and it is the most popular view in evangelicalism today. And that view is that there are two more exceptions. One of them is for infidelity, so adultery, and the other one is for abandonment. And then sometimes people will expand or narrow adultery or expand or narrow abandonment and the definitions of that. And so the exceptions can be wider or narrower, but typically those are the two words they use. And then the question is just like defining the words and applying the facts of a particular case to those exceptional rules. So now I don't think abandonment or adultery permit divorce and remarriage. So now where do they get adultery and abandonment from? Where is that? Well, 7 times in the New Testament, Jesus calls divorce and remarriage adultery. 2 of those times, Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, Jesus gives an exception. And the exception says, except for porneia. So the idea is, in the typical scenario, divorce and remarriage is adultery. And then in the exceptional scenario, divorce and remarriage is not adultery. So the question is, what is this exceptional scenario? And Dr. Mays and most Protestants believe the exceptional scenario is adultery. So if a man was married to a woman, and let's say she cheated on him, the man would be the innocent party, she would be the guilty party, so that he could remarry, but she could not remarry. And so there's actually like a lot of problems with this view. I had this view for 20 years, and then I began to do more research on this. I've read like 30 books on this subject, and I began to notice there's a bunch of issues actually with this view that totally escaped me originally. And most Protestants, evangelicals, have never heard that there are any problems, let alone that there's an avalanche of problems. And we'll get into those problems here in a little bit. So that's the innocent party to adultery view, and that's that Dr. Mays has. And then the abandonment view comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 15, where Paul says the abandoned spouse is, quote, not enslaved, and that's interpreted to mean not married. I think that's an incorrect interpretation there. And we'll talk about all of that. So what do I think these two texts mean? Well, when it comes to the exception clause in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, here's what I think is going on. If you look at the exception clause, it says except for porneia, which is commonly translated as fornication or sexual immorality, an illicit sexual conduct. So if you look at that very carefully, it doesn't actually tell you who committed porneia in the exception clause. That's a deduction and interpretive decision that you have to make. So there's really 3 options, right? So in these 2 texts, in both of them, the man is doing the divorcing. So you could imagine that the man committed porneia. Let's say let's look at that option. Well, this doesn't make a whole lot of moral sense, right? Because this would imagine that a man could divorce his wife because he cheated on her or something. This doesn't make any sense. So it could be the man committed porneia with some third party, but that doesn't make any moral sense. So nobody really actually holds that view. The other view is the adultery view. So this imagines that the woman had sex with some third party while they're married, and that therefore the man has permission to go ahead and divorce and remarry. The idea is he's a victim, she's a perpetrator. The victim gets rights the perpetrator does not get. The innocent gets rights that the guilty does not get. That's the concept behind that. And so that doesn't make some kind of moral sense, but if you look at it more carefully, you begin to notice that there's like a ton of issues with that interpretation, textual issues and logical issues. There's a bunch of issues. Okay, but there is a third option that a lot of people just don't even notice. And the third option is that the porneia is actually between the husband and the wife. And that strikes people as odd because you think, well, they're married, so how could they be committing fornication? That's not a thing. If you're married, you're not committing fornication. But let's suppose for a moment that is what it means. Well, what would be the possible ways that could happen? Well, one, you could say, well, maybe it's incest. And there are some people who hold that. There's a scholar named Fitzmyer who's Catholic. He's written about this theory. And there's actually 3 Catholic translations that appear to be premised on his scholarly work. And they translate the exception clause as something like, except for an invalid marriage, something like that, in 3 Catholic translations from, the last 50 or 60 years or something like that. I have to look up the exact dates, but they've not been around super long. Okay. Well, the problem with that is if you look at Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, there's just nothing in the text that says incest. There's nothing at all. So you'd have to just totally import that. I don't know how Jesus' audience could possibly know that's what he's talking about. You'd have to imagine that they already knew that, and it's just very difficult to kind of prove that. So that seems like it's not going to work. So what ends up happening is scholars notice this. phenomenon with the word porneia, that the word porneia basically means all kinds of illicit sexual conduct, unless there's something in the verse to narrow it to one kind. And they look at the verse and they look at the verse, and they don't see anything to narrow it to one kind there. So they say, well, I guess it has to be all kinds of illicit sexual conduct. And so therefore, and it can't be the man and somebody else, therefore we just have to rule out all other options, and it must be the woman and somebody else. But that's a mistake, because there is something in the verse that could be used to narrow porneia to one kind. And that is imagining that the man married a divorced woman. The idea is the two of them are not married, right? She's still married to her first husband. This is a fake marriage. And the sex in that marriage is adultery against her first husband. It's also fornication between the two of them, because they're not married to each other. So let me explain how that would work, how you could understand the words adultery and fornication to be referring to the same act. You'd think, well, that's odd. You wouldn't use those two words to refer to the same act, right? Let me explain how that would work. So if you look at the atonement, for example, the Bible tells us that Jesus redeemed us. Well, that tells you there was a debt that had to be paid. Or it says we're reconciled. Well, that means there had to be a separation. You're not reconciling nothing. You're reconciling when there's a separation. Something had to be bridged, right? Or propitiation. That means there was wrath that had to be satisfied. So those three words, redeemed, reconciliation, propitiation, tell you an antecedent fact. And in fact, those words are used on purpose to signal to you the antecedent fact in the text. That's what the author is trying to convey. They're trying to say, hey, there was a debt. Hey, there was a separation. Hey, there was wrath. And that problem got solved with the atonement. So they're referring to antecedent facts. And we see that when Jesus calls divorce and remarriage adultery 7 times in the New Testament. He says the remarriage is adultery. What does that mean? What the word adultery tells you, the antecedent fact is they're still married. That's why the remarriage is adultery. They're still actually married to their first spouse. And two unmarried people cannot commit adultery. One of them must be still married. Oh, but they got divorced. That's Jesus' whole point. They got divorced legally, human divorce, but God did not unjoin the marriage, right? That's what Jesus is telling us 7 times in the New Testament when he calls divorce and remarriage adultery. Antecedent fact. The word fornication is also telling you an antecedent fact. What it's telling you is that the two people who had illicit sexual conduct, are not married to each other. That's the reason why the word fornication is used there. It's used to tell you an antecedent fact. So now, how would you get to this idea that the man married a divorced woman from the text? And the way you'd get there is from Matthew 5:32b. So Matthew 5:32 says this: if a man divorces his wife, except for porneia, he makes her commit adultery. Let me pause there. Makes her commit adultery means she is likely to go ahead and remarry, and that would be adultery. So in that sense, he's culpable for her likely remarriage, which would be adultery. So if a man divorces his wife, except for porneia, he makes her commit adultery. And that's Matthew 5:32a. And then Matthew 5:32b is, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now you'll notice in Matthew 5:32, in Mark 10:11 and 12, and in Luke 16:18, Jesus gives 2 statements about divorce and remarriage is adultery. I call them moral formulations. People call them other things, but laws, whatever you want to call them. Divorce, remarriage is adultery. He repeats himself, right? Okay. Now, but if you notice, when Jesus repeats himself in Mark 10, verse 11 and 12, it's not just for emphasis. It's to flip the genders, right? In Mark 10, verse 11, it's if the man divorces and remarries, it's adultery. And then in the next verse, if the woman divorces and remarries, it's adultery. He flips the genders. In Luke 16:18, also flips the genders. Why is Jesus flipping the genders? Isn't it obvious to everybody the rules are the same? No, it is not. It is not obvious. Not in Israel, that area, in 30 AD, roughly. It is not obvious. People think at that time, they're accustomed to moral norms favoring the men. The man can give the wife a certificate of divorce, but she can't give him a certificate of divorce, for example. The man can have multiple wives, but the woman couldn't have multiple husbands. They're accustomed to moral norms being skewed in favor of the man or favoring the man. Okay, so to make sure people don't get confused about that, Jesus flips the genders. Paul does the same thing all throughout 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He's constantly flipping the genders because people are accustomed to thinking moral norms favor the man. Okay, so you might think, oh, that's what Jesus is doing in Matthew 5:32, A and B. Oh, he's flipping the genders. But he's not. He's not flipping the genders. If you look at it very carefully, Matthew 5:32a says if the man divorces, except for porneia, he makes her commit adultery. What does makes her commit adultery tell you? It tells you three things. Number one, it tells you that the man who divorced her, he's culpable for her likely remarriage. Okay, he's got some guilt. It also tells you that she commits adultery when she remarries, right? So she's got some guilt. Well, if she is guilty, then also her husband would be guilty because it takes two to tango. You could tell all of that from Matthew 5:32a. So what is Matthew 5:32b doing there? It's not doing anything unless it's there to explain the exception clause. Because all Matthew 5:32b says is if a man marries a divorced woman, he commits adultery. Everybody would already know that from Matthew 5:32a. Okay, so then you might think, well, then that's weird because then Matthew never flips the genders. Matthew does flip the genders, though. So Matthew 5:32 talks about divorce and remarriage, but so does Matthew 19:9. In Matthew 19:9, what does it say? If a man divorces his wife except for porneia, and if he marries another, he commits adultery. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of them flip the genders. But Matthew includes an exception clause, and Matthew includes an additional, like one of these divorce and remarriage statements, another moral formulation, and that's Matthew 5:32b. And so I think Matthew 5:32b is there to explain porneia in the exception clause. So here's how the exception clause would work then. If a man divorces his wife, he makes her commit adultery, unless it was a fake marriage to begin with. In the sense that he married a divorced woman. It's an invalid marriage. So that's my view. It's the already married view of the exception clause. This was already in the Damascus document text, which was likely written by the Essenes from, over 100 years before Jesus was on the scene there. And they also reference, Genesis 1:27, the same way Jesus references Genesis 1:27 and Mark 10 in his whole argument there. So they're giving kind of the same similar argument that Jesus is giving. And in the Damascus document, there it says that if a man marries two women and everybody's alive, if the man's alive and both the women are alive, that the man commits fornication. It's the Hebrew word for fornication, but it's the same concept. And so it's referring to a second marriage as fornication, which is what I think Jesus is saying in the exception clause of Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. The Damascus document is kind of important because it's part of the whole conversation, debate going on around this time period. And it's using the similar argument that Jesus is using from Genesis 1:27. About using Genesis to talk about divorce and remarriage. Jesus and the Essenes, they're the only people we have doing this. The Pharisees aren't talking about Genesis. Genesis doesn't even occur to them. They're always looking at Deuteronomy 24. Nobody's looking at Genesis except for the Essenes and Jesus, and nobody's using the word fornication except for the Essenes and Jesus with regards to marrying two people, and then it would be sexual sin. And Jesus uses the word fornication, as do the Essenes, and they're talking about the same thing, that the second marriage is the fornication because the two of them are not actually married to each other. The Talmud also in a certain place uses the word fornication to refer to an adulterous remarriage. There the situation is a woman married a man, and then he left and she thought he's dead, so she goes and marries another guy. First husband comes back, and the Talmud says that her marriage to the second man is licentiousness. That's how it's translated into the English, but the Hebrew word in the Talmud is the Hebrew word for fornication, and this is zanut, and these are interlingual synonyms between zanut and porneia. Also, we've got 4 early church writers using the word fornication to refer to sex in a remarriage. So this is a word used in the divorce remarriage debate at the time of Jesus. Okay, so that's my view. Jesus is talking about somebody who is already married. That's my view on the exception clause. With regards to 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul there says that if a spouse is abandoned, that the spouse who's abandoned would be not enslaved. So the idea is a husband and wife are married, and let's say the husband leaves, he divorces, and the wife would now be abandoned, and so she would be, quote, not enslaved. And so the question is, what does not enslaved mean? And I don't think that not enslaved means not married. That means Paul would be referring to marriage as slavery. And I don't know of anybody who would say that the nature of marriage is slavery. That doesn't really make any sense. The word for enslaved there is doulo, which is a different Greek word than deo, which is the word used for the marriage bond. Doulo is never used for the marriage bond. And what Paul is talking about there is he's saying if your spouse abandons you, now you are not encumbered by that difficult relationship. You're free to be able to serve God in more practical ways than you were before. Paul talks about slavery. He continues his analogy in slavery 6 verses later in verse 21. And there he's saying, hey, if you're a slave and you can get free, go for it. That way you can serve God. That's what he's saying there in verse 21 in that section there, which is still in the to the married section from verses 10 to 24 in 1 Corinthians 7. Also note in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1 that the people whom Paul is writing to, this faction in the Corinthian church, they want celibacy. Nobody here is looking for remarriage. Paul is not really excited about them getting married. He wants them to serve God if they can. But hey, listen, people have desires and all that, and so marriage is good for that kind of stuff. So go ahead and get married. But if you can be single and serve God, that'd be better. That Paul says that. But the Corinthians, they want celibacy. So Paul's not really trying to encourage everybody to get married. The Corinthians want celibacy, this faction of them. So it's strange to infer that Paul is telling them in verse 15, congratulations, you can remarry. Nobody's looking for remarriage. It's just not in the text. And you have to kind of infer that, and it's kind of a strange inference when it goes contrary to the context in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. Also, it would imagine that Paul and Jesus contradict each other. I mean, Jesus is talking about all marriages. He's talking about Pharisees who are unbelievers. He's rooting it in creation. This is all marriages he's talking about there. And there's no way you can read anything from Jesus there and say there's an abandonment exception. So you'd have to say that Paul has an abandonment exception that Jesus does not have, and that would make them contradict each other. I mean, anybody hearing Jesus at the time would have thought, if my spouse abandons me and I remarry, Jesus calls that adultery. So that would be a contradiction then between Paul and Jesus, and I don't think we can read them to contradict each other. Okay, so now that we have that background on my view, now you can compare that to Dr. Mays' view, and we're going to go ahead and hear what he has to say.
So if anybody gets remarried after a divorce, that's actually adultery. But there is an exception, and that's death. Whoever remarries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. But there's an implied exception here, unless her former spouse has died. Now that's clear from many passages in the Old Testament, also in the Gospel, where Jesus talks about marriage as something that's only for this life. And in heaven, we won't be married. We'll be like the angels, neither marrying nor given in marriage. So what that means then is, if there is someone who has, let's say, a woman who has gotten wrongly divorced from her husband, she should not have, and then he dies, well, she's no longer married. Also, according to God, she is no longer married. So if she were to remarry, that would not be adultery because she is not married. So that has to be kept in mind. This is important because, for example, in Mark's gospel, there is no exception that's given for this statement that whoever marries a divorced woman is committing adultery, or whoever divorces his wife and marries another is committing adultery. No exception is given. And yet, from other passages of Scripture, and also the nature of marriage itself, we have to also say there is an exception, and that is death. So that brings then this important statement, this important principle, that everybody recognizes that even though we have a categorical prohibition of the Lord that whoever remarries after divorce is committing adultery, there is an exception. And everybody recognizes this, except Mormons maybe. I don't know what they would think about it, but we're not going to worry about that. But everybody recognizes this, no matter what their position, whether they're Roman Catholic, evangelical, anti-Nicene, or anti-Reformation view. Everybody recognizes that there is an exception that has to be kept in mind, and that exception is not found here, but it's found in other passages of Scripture. That's an important exegetical point. You have general principles, but those general principles do not overrule exceptions that are given clearly in other places.
The reason why Dr. Mays is really driving home this point is that a lot of marriage permanence people, and I'm a marriage permanence guy, make an argument that since the exception clause we talked about, except for porneia, is in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19, but not in Mark 10 or Luke 16, the exception must not be referring to divorcing a valid marriage. So let's say the absence of it from a couple of texts must mean can't be talking about a valid marriage. It must be about a betrothal that's divorced, or an incest marriage that's divorced, or a remarriage that's divorced. Now, that's my view. Or not an exception, but an exclusion. They think, one of these things, but it can't be a divorce of a valid marriage, because otherwise people who only have Mark or Luke would be like misled. That's like kind of their argument. Now, I agree, though, with Dr. May's contention in general that you can have a rule in one place and an exception elsewhere. So, for example, you have Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. It says, don't kill anybody, basically. But later on, in the Torah, we have, you can do capital punishment actually, and there is such a thing as just war, for example. So you can have a rule in one place and exceptions in another place. But here's what I would say. If you look at something like Genesis 9:6, the person who wrote that was Moses, and Moses is there for the rest of it. So he knows what the exceptions are, and he's writing the rest of it. So they've got all of that there. Even if he hasn't written, Deuteronomy yet, he's there. So he knows what the exceptions then would be. So you have that with Moses. And if you look at this exception with death, you have the exception of death in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke. So you've already got that. You've also got it in Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians 7. So you've got the exception with death for that allows remarriage. But what you don't have is the exception for porneia in all of those different texts. Now it's true the exception for death isn't in the same like chapter or whatever in Luke 16 or in Mark chapter 10, but it's later on in the same gospel. So it is in that text. They do have that. The people who only have Mark, people who only have Luke, people who only have Romans 7, people who only have 1 Corinthians 7, and even if you want to leave Romans 7 out because it's an analogy. But the point is they don't have the exception clause there. So here's what I would say. I don't really depend on this argument. I think it has some merit to it, but I don't think it's really all that strong because the bottom line is if there was an exception in one place and not in another, and we could tell that two communities didn't have that text at the same time, if you had to force the issue and you had to say, does the exception apply or not, you'd have to say the exception applies. So yes, if it is a true exception, like if it's for infidelity, for example, you'd have to say the exception applies. But what I'm saying is that is a point that does count somewhat to disfavor that interpretation. Like that is not the only possible interpretation of the exception clause that's for infidelity. So when you have, different possible interpretations that are out there, that's a point in disfavor of that view. But again, I think it's a relatively weaker point. I think there are stronger arguments that you can make against the innocent party to adultery view. So I don't really depend on that or use that one that much. So that's how I would characterize it. I think it's easy to articulate, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's repeated so much in marriage permanent circles, but I don't actually think it's that strong here. But I don't think that his exception for death argument is as strong as maybe it sounds at the beginning, because you can find exceptions for death to be able to remarry in Mark and Luke and Matthew. All right, so let's continue where he's going to describe his view on the exception clause.
Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality or fornication or unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Okay, but there's that exception there, except for any reason except sexual immorality. And the same thing comes up in a different time, a different situation in Matthew's gospel, and this is Matthew 19:9. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Okay, so there you have the exception in two different places. So it's not the divorcing that is adultery. It is the remarrying after a wrongful divorce. And yet here, Jesus gives an exception that actually takes some cases out of this general prohibition. That is to say, if there has been a case of unchastity. So I like to use these hypothetical names, fictitious names, and I get the names from ancient Rome. So we've got Caius as the hypothetical husband and Saya as the hypothetical wife. So Caius commits adultery. Saya then has grounds to divorce him. She can divorce him, and God permits that. If she divorces him, God has permitted that divorce. Therefore, she is permitted by God to remarry. Why? Because she is no longer married. So that is what I'm trying to say here. But before I'm not going to rest my case there. Let's go ahead and look at some other issues. Okay, this word for unchastity. The word for unchastity or sexual immorality in the New King James Version, sometimes is translated fornication, is the word porneia. Now, there's two ways of misunderstanding this. Sometimes people take this word as being too narrow and sometimes too broad. It is too narrow if it is said to be spiritual idolatry.
Yeah. So let me just say, I totally agree with him that it's not idolatry. There's nothing in the context to limit it to idolatry. Jesus' hearers could have no idea that's what he meant if he meant that. And, really looking at what Jesus said through the lens as best you can of his hearers, what his audience would have thought is really helpful. It really helps to rule out a lot of kind of aberrant views, like this idea that porneia would be idolatry. That's not what Jesus meant there. So before having him go on, let me just let you know some of the challenges with the innocent party to adultery view. Now, again, I held this view for 20 years. I firmly believed it. And then what happened was I did some research and I kept finding issue after issue after issue. And I had to find a way to use some theological duct tape to hold the thing together until finally I realized this doesn't work. It's more duct tape than it is text at some point. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So first of all, if you look at Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, the man is divorcing. So in both those exception clauses, then, if it's for infidelity, it imagines the woman committed adultery, not the man. Well, then the innocent party to adultery view is a problem because the innocent party to adultery view imagines that the innocent party can divorce and remarry, not just only if he's a man or a woman. But where's the text with the exception clause for the woman who's cheated on? Now, people hear this who have the innocent party to adultery view and they kind of scoff. But let's think about this for a moment. So this is 30 AD in Israel. People are accustomed to moral norms favoring the man. A man could divorce his wife with a certificate of divorce. She can't divorce him. A man can have multiple wives. A woman cannot have multiple husbands. We know Jesus and Paul are thinking, oh, these people are going to think the moral norms favor the men. And that's why Paul is repeating, if the man and then if the woman, if the man, if the woman in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's going back and forth with the genders. Jesus is going back and forth with the genders in Luke 16:18 and in Mark 10:11 and 12, and then Matthew 5:32 and then Matthew 19:9, also flipping the genders. So there's all of this work to flip the genders, especially on the question of rules for divorce and remarriage, especially there. But then it's not done for the exception clause. What would people at that time think? They would think, oh, if the man is cheated on, he can divorce and remarry. But if the woman is cheated on, she can't divorce and remarry. That's what they would have thought Jesus meant if they thought he was referring to infidelity in the exception clause. So the innocent party to adultery view just textually just does not work. If you're culturally sensitive to the people to whom Jesus was speaking and you look at it through the view of his audience, it would not work. At the time of Jesus, there were two schools of rabbis. There was Hillel and there was Shammai. And when Jesus' view is commonly taught by pastors, evangelicals, they'll say, well, there was Hillel. Hillel lets you divorce for burning the toast, which is true, weird, but true. And then Shammai would only let you divorce if it was adultery or like adultery adjacent conduct. That is not totally accurate. Shammai would not allow a woman to divorce her husband for adultery or adultery adjacent conduct. It was gendered. So if people think that Jesus taught a Shammai type view, you would have to conclude Jesus taught a gendered exception. And this is really a problem. This actually makes the problem worse, because how would you be able to think that Jesus' audience, if they thought he meant except for infidelity in the exception clause, and they're accustomed to, oh, there's this really popular teacher named Rabbi Shammai, and he seems to hold the same view as Jesus. It sounds very much like that. All the more reason why they would have interpreted the exception to be gendered. And there is no exception clause. We're talking about a woman divorcing a man for porneia. That does not exist. Now, Jesus does talk about a woman divorcing a man in Mark 10, verse 12. It's right there. So Jesus can imagine, oh yeah, a woman divorcing a man there, because under Roman law, they could do that. I understand under Jewish law, they couldn't, but under Roman law, they could. So there is no flipping of the genders with the exception clause. And so I just think there's no way you can get around the gendered problem here. And in fact, there were some people in the early church who, that's how they interpreted it. They thought it was for adultery, and they thought only the man could divorce for adultery, but the woman could not divorce for adultery, because they were being sensitive to the culture and the time and the actual literal text that they have before them in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. Now, if porneia is what I think it is, which is referring to an invalid marriage, it's invalid because the man married a divorced woman. We have that in the context there of Matthew 5:32b. If it's that, then what it turns on is the invalidity of the marriage. So the question you would ask is the marriage invalid? Yes, then you could divorce and you could remarry. And it wouldn't be adultery against their non-spouse, their invalid spouse, their fake spouse. It wouldn't be adultery against them because they were never married. Who are they committing adultery against? Nobody's married in an invalid marriage. So you don't have a gendered problem with my interpretation of the exception clause, but I do think you have a gendered problem with Dr. May's interpretation. All right, here's the second problem with the innocent party to adultery view, and that is Matthew chapter 19, verses 7 and 8. So Matthew chapter 19, verse 7, the Pharisees say to Jesus, "Why then did Moses command a writing of divorcement?" And then Jesus responds that Moses allowed you to divorce for your hard-heartedness, but from the beginning it was not so. So Jesus rejects the Mosaic allowance for divorce. What he's saying is, listen, divorcing was always immoral. It was tolerated under Moses because you had hard-heartedness. And from this, we learn that there were certain things that the force of government was not used to stop because people had hard hearts. In other words, when the Mosaic law came in, it didn't prohibit all types of immoral conduct. There were some kinds of immoral conduct that it tolerated. And now under Jesus, he's fulfilling the law. He's bringing out the perfect law. And he's saying, we're not tolerating that anymore. So in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8, he says that the reason for the divorce there under Moses was for hard-heartedness. Okay. Well, if you look at what Moses said there in Deuteronomy chapter 24, he's talking about in verse 1, a man gives his wife a certificate of divorce after he finds in her a matter of uncleanness. And the Hebrew words there is ervat debar, and ervat is talking about nakedness. It's almost always referring to some kind of sexual sin when it's talking about a man and a woman kind of a thing there. So it sounds like the man's divorcing her for adultery. That would be kind of the natural reading. Well, some people disagree with that, and I have a whole video where I talk about the whole Deuteronomy 24 thing, because some people would say, well, you'd get capital punishment, but actually I think that's a misreading of how the law was applied at that time. Okay, but just taking that objection off to the side, Jeremiah chapter 3 talks about Deuteronomy 24. Here we have a prophet talking about Deuteronomy chapter 24 that could help us figure out what ervat debar means. And in Jeremiah chapter 3, very clearly the divorce that happens there is for adultery. You see that in verse 1, you see it in verse 8 of Jeremiah chapter 3. So it seems very clear that Deuteronomy chapter 24 in verse 1 was referring to divorcing for adultery. And in fact, the other part about this with Matthew 19, 7 and 8 is the Pharisees that come to Jesus. These are clearly Hillel Pharisees. We see that from verse 3, talking about an any cause divorce. And then Jesus says, no, you can't divorce just for any cause. Okay. And then you get to verse 7 and they ask a follow-up question. Well, why did Moses command to give a writing divorcement and send her away? This word command is a very strange kind of word here. Are we supposed to think the Pharisees thought every time she burns the toast, you have to divorce her? That seems kind of odd. We get a little help from this in the Talmud, in the Gemara portion of Gittin 9:10, where we learn that, and this is also in David Instone Brewer's book, we learn that the view of Hillel was that you may divorce for any cause, but you must divorce if she commits adultery. It's right there in the Talmud. That was Hillel's view. These are Hillel Pharisees. So their first question was, any cause divorce, burning the toast? Jesus says, no divorce. And then they say, follow-up question, why did Moses command us to divorce? What they're asking in Matthew 19:7 is, why did Moses command us divorce if our wife cheated on us? That's what they're asking. Why must we divorce for adultery? And Jesus in Matthew 19:8 says, divorcing for adultery was allowed for your hard-heartedness, but from the beginning it was not so. It was tolerated for you to divorce your wife if she cheated on you, but that was wrong. You should not divorce. It is hard-hearted to divorce your wife for adultery. So it is not possible that Jesus said in verse 8, it is hard-hearted to divorce for adultery, and then in verse 9, he says it's morally permissible to divorce for adultery. So therefore, the exception clause cannot be referring to adultery because Jesus specifically rejects divorce for adultery in Matthew 19, verse 8. And there's some other problems with viewing the exception clause as being for infidelity. For example, it's irrational to allow divorce for infidelity, but then not for like worse conduct. So if a husband and wife are married and they have a baby and there's an infant and one of them kills the infant, well, that's worse than infidelity. And it's kind of strange to say, well, you can divorce for one and not the other. And Origen actually was the one who brought this up. I thought it was a remarkable point that he said there, and he referred to it as irrational. Nevertheless, he thought you could divorce for adultery. He didn't think you could remarry. He thought you could divorce for adultery. And I think he's right, though, that there is a real problem if you're going to say that the exception clause is for infidelity. You had this real issue with, and everybody kind of feels that when you think about what if there's worse conduct. It's just weird that you can't divorce for another reason. And so then in order to get around that, you have to do a bunch of theological duct tape. You have to say, well, it's because of the nature of the infidelity. Okay, but when you get to the abandonment, what is that all about? So I don't think this really works real well when you think about conduct that's worse than adultery. The whole concept behind the innocent party to adultery view is it sets up a victim perpetrator framework, and it's using that to kind of give the moral weight, the moral justification to be able to divorce and remarriage, to help you understand it from that kind of moral, that place in your moral intuition. Well, that doesn't work then, because when there's worse victimization, you would think, well, you could still divorce and remarry. But Jesus doesn't give another, he doesn't say adultery or worse, right? Also, the exception clause being for infidelity contradicts the context. So in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3-6, Jesus is building an argument. He's got premises, he's taking data from Genesis and expounding on it. And Matthew 3-6 is building a no exception argument. It is totally clearly a no exception argument. He's talking about, well, they wouldn't divorce in the Garden of Eden. Why do you think you should be able to divorce? It's just a no exception argument. So then how do you get from a no exception argument to a conclusion with an exception? That would make the conclusion to not follow the premise, not follow the argument. So it would be a non sequitur. So this is a real problem, I think, for people who think that the exception clause is for infidelity, because it makes Jesus kind of argue with himself. He gives an argument over here and he gives a conclusion that doesn't match his own argument. Another challenge is more theological. If you think that God's intention, his heart, his ideal is to keep a marriage together even after one of the spouses commits adultery, then to imagine that the moral law permits an exception for divorce and remarriage after adultery is to imagine that the moral law is not a reflection of God's character. But theologically, this doesn't make any sense. The moral law teaches us what it means to be holy, for he is holy. And in the exception clause of Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 cannot permit divorce and remarriage after adultery if we're going to say that the moral law is a reflection of God's character, and God's character would say, don't divorce and remarry if you're the innocent party to adultery. Now let's give one more challenge before we continue to hear Dr. Mays, and that is the Schrodinger's marriage dilemma. So suppose you have a husband and wife, and they're married, and say the husband cheats and the wife divorces. Here's a question. Are they married or not married? If they're married still, despite the divorce, if God views them as still being married despite the divorce, then it's adultery if either one of them remarries, because both of them would be violating their marriage. Okay, now let's suppose a husband and wife are married and the wife cheats and they get divorced. And now let's say they're both unmarried. Let's say that's your position. I think that's Dr. Mays' position. Well, if they're both unmarried and they go to marry single people, that's not adultery. Definitionally, that is not adultery. If an unmarried person marries a single person, they can't commit adultery. That's not a thing. Somebody has to be married in order to commit adultery. So this is the Schrodinger's marriage problem, because it imagines that the guilty party is still married and the innocent party is not married. So they're married and not married at the same time. It's a Schrodinger's marriage. Either they're married or they're not married. It's an on-off switch. You can't have one married and the other one not married. It doesn't really work. So in order to get around this, what people have to do is they have to say, well, the adultery then is, violation of something else. They'll say they're unmarried. And so the remarriage then, in that case, for the guilty party is adultery, but it's adultery because it's something else. It's not cheating on a marriage. It's cheating on whatever, a vow to God or whatever. They try to find something else. That is not the meaning of the word adultery. That's number one. And number two, let's say we're going to imagine a new meaning for the word adultery. We're just going to invent a new meaning and put it on the text. Well, that means the word adultery is functioning in two different ways at the same time. And that's just not how the Greek words work. The word means something. It doesn't mean two different things at the same time that are mutually exclusive from each other. So that is a real problem with the innocent party to adultery view. All right, so let's continue to hear Dr. Mays.
In the Old Testament, for example, a lot of times when people commit idolatry, this is talked about as whoring away from the Lord. Okay, so that is using metaphorical language from fornication and from prostitution, and is used to apply to one's faithfulness to God. So idolatry would be joining oneself spiritually to a false god. Well, that's not what the Lord is talking about here. There's no mention of anything having to do with idolatry here. In fact, who he was talking to were the Pharisees and the Jews. So the Pharisees, like, they're not committing adultery. They're not committing idolatry. So that issue of spiritual idolatry is not really even on the table. So we really ought to remove that. Now, what that would do, if you actually believe that what's meant by unchastity here is spiritual idolatry, you would be saying that if somebody becomes an unbeliever, it's okay to divorce that person. And that's not what the Lord is saying. And it becomes very clear from 1 Corinthians 7 that that's not the meaning. But let's go on. A more common argument is to say that this word porneia means incest. It's a common argument. And why people would say that unchastity here really means incest is so that they can avoid saying that literal unchastity is grounds for divorce. That is to say, they would say, okay, he's not really talking about unchastity. He's talking about incest. So if it was incest, really by God's will, they were never married in the first place. And that's the only reason they would say that the Lord permits divorce in this situation and remarriage, is because it was really incestuous all along. It was never actually a marriage. And so therefore it was, of course, it's okay to get remarried because one was never actually married. However, if it were incest, that would be grounds for annulment, and that would not be optional.
Okay, so I don't have the incest view of the exception clause for the same reasons that Dr. Mays is about to provide here in a moment. But I do want to mention a couple of things. First, they didn't have annulments at the time of Jesus. They had a ketubah for contracts for marriage, and they had divorce certificates. Yeah, if you had an invalid marriage, you divorced it. And second, the exception clauses don't say whether in the exceptional situation the divorce is required or optional. It only says by implication that if you divorce in the exceptional situation, you can remarry. And so Dr. Mays thinks the exception clauses say divorcing in the exceptional situation is optional, but they don't actually say whether it's optional or not. To determine whether or not it's optional, you have to determine what Jesus meant by porneia and then make a deduction.
Because marriage always needs to be according to God's word. And if it were incest, that would contradict God's will and his definition of marriage. So that would not be, that would be the case, that annulment would be called for. But in Matthew 5 and in 19, divorce is not actually mandated. It's not saying that you would have to divorce somebody who has committed fornication. It's making it optional.
You know, the other problem here is that if the marriage is invalid, but the governing body at the time doesn't think it's invalid, then you would have to get a legal divorce. So that's what you would have to do. So you can't always say, well, I'll get an annulment instead. Sometimes you can't get an annulment, and they didn't really do the annulment thing back at the time of Jesus. We have examples in the Talmud that talk about somebody is in a fake marriage, according to the Talmud, and the way they get out of it is a divorce.
Andrew Doss recently wrote a book called Remarriage in Early Christianity, and he and I agree on many things and disagree on many things as well. But he does a really great job of defining what the words mean. And on page 119, he has a number of arguments against saying that unchastity, porneia, could possibly mean incest in the narrow sense. He brings up this point that the church fathers never take porneia here as incest. Likewise, Matthew's audience would have been aware of the prohibitions of Leviticus 18, and violations would have been too rare to justify Matthew's exception clauses. Rather, Jesus was referring to the divorce practice among the Jews for any cause, and that was the context in both Mark 10 and in Matthew 19. That's what the Pharisees had come to Jesus asking about, specifically Deuteronomy 24 and how that was to be understood. Another argument that Doss brings up, which is very good, is that the Old Testament Greek translation, the Septuagint, does not use the Greek word porneia to talk about the sins of incest in Leviticus 18. So in order for this to be taken as incest, you would have to have clear contextual clues hinting at a technical meaning that refers to Leviticus 18, and that's simply not here. So porneia was not a technical term for incest, and therefore we can safely set that aside. That is not a strong argument for how to understand what unchastity is meaning in Matthew 5 and 19.
I completely agree with that.
Okay, intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles. Again, that's not what the Pharisees were asking about. It doesn't come up in the context, so therefore it would be wrong to narrow the meaning of that word to that. Likewise, it does not specifically talk about fornication before marriage. Again, what were the Pharisees asking about? They were asking about divorce in a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 24. Okay, and then I have violation of another man's bed. That actually is a wrong. That's like a classical Roman way of understanding adultery. But we'll just set that aside as not.
So on this objection here, or this potential other view, I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that. So that'd be something I'd like some clarification as to what he thinks is included in that category.
Not what unchastity means. So let's go on. And we also have a possibility of too broad. So the conjugal union.
So real quick, sorry, before you continue there, because I think it's important as well, because oftentimes what I've seen from Roman Catholic apologists sort of talking about this issue is that they'll argue that, well, because the Greek word for fornication, moikeia, right, I think is how you say it, was not used here, therefore we should not take it that way. And so based on that, but something that I thought was worth mentioning from page 45 of your book, right? So you say, like, why was porneia often, why was porneia, often translated fornication, used here rather than moikeia, adultery? And so you talk about how porneia is a more general term, which could be used for both female and male adultery, whereas moikeia was only used for male adultery. Which
I don't think that the use of the word porneia instead of moikeia means a whole lot here in the exception clause. And I don't think that really tells you what Jesus meant by the word porneia there. But this argument that moikeia was only used for male adultery, I just don't think that really holds up. So Jesus says that a woman who remarries commits adultery in Matthew 5:32 and in Mark 10:12. So there's a woman who commits adultery, uses the word moikeia. In Matthew 5:32 has the exception clause, so it wouldn't be confusing to use moikeia in the exception clause there to refer to a woman who committed adultery, if that's what you thought that meant. Now, if you look at Romans chapter 7, Paul says in the law, so things that Jewish people understood at the time, he writes, to those of you who know the law, that if a woman married a second husband, she would be called an adulteress. So that's obviously something people understood at the time with that use of the word moikeia. John chapter 8, it has the woman caught in adultery, and it uses moikeia. Revelation 2:22 has Jezebel committing moikeia. So I don't think using porneia instead of moikeia tells you for sure that Jesus meant something other than moikeia in the exception clause. I think we can figure that out from other things like I've already mentioned here. But the other thing, though, is I wouldn't make a gender argument. I don't think that's a reason to say, porneia was used to make it that kind of gender neutral either way. I don't think the word porneia tells you, it's gender neutral. What porneia instead of moikeia does tell us is that Jesus had something in particular in mind, which I think is talking about an invalid marriage, because a man, for example, married a divorced woman, she's already married. And so their marriage is an invalid marriage. And so Jesus is using the word fornication to refer to that antecedent fact that the two of them are not married to each other.
I thought was a pretty good, I hadn't heard somebody bring that up before, which I thought was relevant to bring up here. Because sometimes they'll make a big deal out of that, where they'll say, if they wanted to use this more common word for adultery, and that's what they wanted to convey, why didn't they reach for that more common word? But I thought that was a good sort of grammatical reason why.
Yeah, you need to be aware of how words are used in the first century context. Andrew Doss's book is really good at the analysis of meaning of words in the first century. So it's really great. But also David Instone Brewer's books has done good work as what the meaning of, I think it's been a while since I read him, but I think he does also good work on what the meaning of these words is. And hopefully we're not frozen here. Okay, so yeah, it is important, but also I think what really is the telltale sign is keeping in mind rhetorically, what were the Pharisees asking about? And if Jesus doesn't change the subject, then he's answering them about that question. So that's important. And that then brings us to the next slide, which is when the meaning is made too broad. So it becomes too broad if then unchastity is defined as being other non-sexual sins. So sometimes it has been argued that whatever would be just as bad as unchastity or worse would also be grounds for divorce. So, for example, which would be a worse sin, murder or adultery? Maybe murder. For the sake of argument, we'll say murder would be worse. And so it would be argued that then unchastity would also include any sin that's worse. Okay, but that's not actually what the Lord says. And we can't broaden that word to mean more than what he is saying here.
Okay, so I agree with Dr. Mays that infidelity, if that's what Jesus meant in the exception clause, does not include murder. That's just a total category error. There's no way that would make any sense. But it does, like I said earlier, pose a problem for the innocent party to adultery view because it's premised on a concept of victim and perpetrator. And so since like murdering an infant, for example, their child would be worse than committing adultery, it doesn't make any moral sense to be able to say you can divorce for one and then not for the other.
So adultery in the heart. This is one that always comes up. Matthew 5:28, it's from the Sermon on the Mount. And the Lord says, going back to verse 27, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So then if you go forward a couple verses to 32, people say, okay, well, are we talking then about the adultery that's being talked about here is adultery in the heart? So if Caius looks at a woman and lusts after her in his heart, and Saya somehow is able to prove this, then that's grounds for her to divorce him. That would be too broad of an understanding. In Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, the Lord does not say except for fornication in the heart. Keep in mind, if it was fornication in the heart, then there would be grounds for every single marriage in the whole world to be divorced, because there's not a single person who I think could truthfully claim not to have had immoderate lust in one's heart. So that would then mean that essentially Jesus' strong prohibition would be completely nullified and made meaningless. That cannot be what the Lord intended here. Out of the heart proceed murders and adulteries. And this is the case with everybody. And so therefore, this cannot be a cause or a permissible cause for divorce. That is not what the Lord is talking about. It has also been noted that immoderate lust towards one spouse cannot be what's meant here. So Johann Gerhardt talks about that. I don't think I'm going to get into that in any more detail at this time. Sometimes it has been objected that Matthew 5 and 19 cannot be giving a real exception. And the way that this is argued is that what it's doing is it's making a tautology. So if we look at Matthew 19:9, "Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." And it has been claimed that this is a tautology. That is to say, if she already committed adultery, then she's already an adulteress. So therefore, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And in Matthew 5:32, makes her to commit adultery. So I say to you, this is Matthew 5:32, "Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery." And so it's claimed that at least in Matthew 5:32, that this would just be a tautology. That is to say, she's already made herself an adulteress, so therefore he's not making her an adulteress if he were to divorce her. Okay, so that is sometimes an objection that you will see. However, in my response, and I use that r/period anytime I want to make that's my symbol for making a response. In Matthew 5:32, makes her to commit adultery, it refers to the future, not to the past. So this cannot be a tautology. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality in the past makes her to commit adultery in the future. So it cannot be talking about the same thing. So we can safely set that one aside. When the Lord is giving the exception in Matthew 5:19, he's not simply saying, well, of course, if he or she has already committed adultery, then of course they're committing adultery. That's not what he's saying.
Yeah, so I agree with what he says here. I would say the stronger argument is that it can't mean that in Matthew 19:9, and the exception clause must mean the same thing in both texts, because in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, there it says, if a man divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another, he commits adultery. So the conduct there is that the man is committing adultery by the remarriage. And so divorce by itself, he wouldn't be committing adultery. So if somebody just divorces except for fornication, that's not adultery. So you'd have to make it so that divorcing except for fornication would mean he commits adultery, and that's just not something that doesn't work. That's not what adultery is. Divorce, there's no sex happening in just a divorce. You need sex in order to have adultery. Maybe somebody could claim this with Matthew 5:32, but I think Professor Mays makes a good argument about the past versus the future. But with Matthew 19:9, I mean, there's just no way you can say that, because you'd have to make it so that that the exception only applies to the divorce and it doesn't apply to the remarriage, which means the divorce itself would be adultery in the non-exceptional situation, which is impossible. And then the remarriage would also be adultery. And the problem with that, of course, is that divorce by itself doesn't commit adultery. What's happening in Matthew 5:32 is he's making her commit adultery. But that's not the verb in Matthew 19:9. In the Matthew 19:9, the verb is commit. So it's one thing to say that divorce causes somebody else to commit adultery. That's totally different than making a nonsensical statement that divorcing is committing adultery. No, it's not. Maybe you could say it's causing the other person to commit adultery, but you can't say it's committing adultery. Nobody had sex with anybody else. So that view of the exception clause doesn't work.
Okay, another objection is to start with Mark 10, which does not have the exception for unchastity, and say that is the real reading, and we have to essentially explain away Matthew 5:32 and 19:9. So in Mark 10, 11 to 12, there's no exception. So is that the right key to understand Matthew 5 and 19? Well, we can't take one passage of scripture and use it to rule out and explain away a clear passage somewhere else. That would simply be a wrong reading of scripture. A passage that lacks an exception should not be understood as denying an exception that is clearly stated elsewhere. We already noted this for the exception of death. Mark 10 does not mention death. And yet it is commonly acknowledged that because of other passages which do acknowledge that marriage ends at death, if a divorced person were to remarry after the death of his or her spouse, that would not be adultery.
Right. But the difference with the death exception is that the death exception is in Mark, it is in Luke, it is in Matthew. But the exception for porneia is not in Mark or in Luke. And so that does make it a little uncomfortable. But again, I don't think it's like a defeater. I think it's a point that would disfavor the interpretation of the exception clause as for being for infidelity. Now, I do agree with him on this, that if it was just absolutely rock solid, the only way you could possibly interpret the exception clause as being for infidelity, I would say that even though that's a point in disfavor of it, there really is no other option other than viewing it as an exception for infidelity. And then you'd have to say, well, for some reason it's not in Mark and Luke, we don't know why. That's what you'd have to do. But That's not the place that we're in when we're first approaching the text. When we're first approaching the text, we're like, well, it says except for porneia. What could it possibly mean? Let's look at the whole menu of possibilities. And when you look at the whole menu of possibilities, it is not clear cut that it must be for infidelity. And I think that really the two options, after you kind of go through all these other possibilities, as Dr. Mays is doing a very good job with, and he shows, it just can't be for incest, and it can't be like an exclusion, and it can't be for idolatry. He's doing a very good job ruling all those out. But when you come down to either it's infidelity or it's an already married person, when you look at those two, the already married view does much better than the infidelity view when you look at the arguments for and against. And one of those arguments would be the fact that it's not in Mark and not in Luke. That doesn't cause a problem for the already married view, but it does cause a problem for the infidelity view. I would just say, though, that problem is relatively small. People make a bigger deal out of it than is really warranted. You need stronger arguments to really kind of say that the innocent party to adultery view is wrong. So I think it's relevant to bring up. I do think it's a relevant consideration. I just don't think it's like a super strong argument.
Sometimes the people that bring up Mark 10 as the real reading and that this then rules out the exceptions are doing so from the standpoint of source criticism of the Gospels. So source criticism of the Gospels, the basic idea here is that we have this situation of maybe unknown authorship. We don't really know who wrote Matthew and Mark and Luke. There are these hypothetical Matthean and Markan and Lucan communities that were the original either authors or at least recipients of the Gospels. And it's also hypothesized that they might not have known anything about any other communities, any other Christian churches, and would not have had any access to other Gospels. Okay, so this is all very hypothetical. So the basic idea with this is that the original Markan community, so the church that originally received Mark's Gospel, received only Mark's Gospel, had no knowledge of Matthew, and Mark's Gospel does not have an exception. So therefore, they would have, it is thought, received this instruction as not including any exceptions. That's the argument. But I would respond that this denies the divine authorship and the unity of Scripture. It treats the Gospels as documents that are written for isolated communities decades after the Passion and the Resurrection. Now, we can debate about when the Gospels exactly were written, but there's no reason to think that there are these isolated churches and communities that knew nothing about what was being taught in other churches and communities. That's highly unlikely. Also, it is just as likely that Matthew was the first gospel and that Mark was an abbreviation of Matthew. The practice of abbreviation was a common technique among rabbis in the first century. So this very often happens that texts would be in a longer form and then abbreviated for more, faster writing and distribution. And then my final point is that all of Scripture was written for the whole church to read and learn from. 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is divinely inspired and is given for teaching and other purposes. Therefore, even if there were a hypothetical Markan or Lucan community isolated from Matthew's gospel, that still is just a hypothesis that has no dogmatic value that could undermine or explain away the exceptions that are in Matthew.
Okay, so I agree the critical scholarship, perspective there is just like very unhelpful. So I totally agree with him on that. But the lack of an exception in Mark and Luke and 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11, where Paul is paraphrasing Jesus and there's no exception, and that was almost certainly written before the Gospels, is still uncomfortable. If the exception is to be interpreted as infidelity, it's an uncomfortable fact. Again, not a defeater, but it's still a point that disfavors this particular reading of the exception clause as being for the innocent party to adultery. It is not uncomfortable at all if you believe that the exception clause is referring to a man who married a divorced woman, for example, the already married view of the exception clause, because it's an invalid marriage. So if you read Mark 10, 11, and 12, you could deduce that an invalid marriage would be one that would not preclude you from marrying somebody else if that invalid marriage was divorced. So then, the question might be, well, why would you then even need to say the exception clause? And I think because a question is going to arise. Well, this person was actually married before. Can they marry somebody else? I know it was an invalid marriage, but still it was a marriage. And so people might ask that question. And so you have the exception clause there. The other thing the exception clause does from the already married perspective is it makes it just crystal clear. This is an invalid marriage. This is a fake marriage, because validly married people, you wouldn't say that the sex that they have, you wouldn't call that fornication. You call it fornication if you're trying to say they're not married to each other. So it makes it crystal clear, in case there was any doubt whatsoever, that the adulterous remarriage is a fake marriage. And so the exception clause would also clarify that in case there was any confusion. So it does clarify a couple of things in case there's any confusion. The one is, what if my first marriage was to an already married person? Can I go ahead and remarry? That it would answer that question in case that came up. And the other one, it would be, well, it's adultery, but is it an invalid marriage? People have that confusion today. And if somebody had that confusion back then, this makes it crystal clear. No, that is a fake marriage. So the exception clause does have an educational purpose there in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 from the already married view, and doesn't have all of the challenges. It's really like an avalanche of problems with the infidelity view, the innocent party to adultery view.
Also, for people at home to think through this, for your, I think, earliest point on this slide, when it comes to the scriptures often will give these sort of general principles, and then in other places give you what are obviously key exceptions to those principles. So one example that comes to mind for me is like the book of Proverbs has all kinds of things to say about the wise and those who are diligent with their hands and so on and so forth, right? So we see the ant held up as a model of wisdom, right? Because without an overseer, it prepares its bread, or rather gathers its food during the harvest to ensure it has provisions. We see, for example, Proverbs 10:4, lazy hands make for poverty, diligent hands bring wealth. Or Proverbs 12:11, those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense, so on and so forth. But then you turn over to Ecclesiastes, for example, and in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11, we see, quote, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. And so then, an overly wooden reading of these would be like, oh no, there's complete contradiction here. When in reality, it's like, no, the wisdom literature is telling you, in general, what are the right principles to follow, and then in general, the benefits that follow a rightful keeping of those principles. But also, here's the exceptions, right? Like, it's not always that the fight goes to the strong or the race to the swift. And
another great example would be like the fourth commandment. So honor your father and your mother, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Okay. Well, did Jesus do that? He sure did. And yet he was crucified. Yeah. So this is what we call the exception of the Holy Cross, that we do have these, especially with these promises that God makes for worldly prosperity and happiness as a reward for obeying his law. That actually is a general principle which usually holds true. But we also then have the exception of the Holy Cross.
And we can think even of some of the patterns that we see here, like even with Proverbs, or what you're describing, which is we have these general principles, but then normally what is it that then introduces some of these glitches in the system, as it were, where we have some exceptions, and it seems to be sin, right? Sin is what makes it such that the wise man who's following everything that he should be, even if it's not his own sin, it's also the sin, just a sinful condition of the world around him, right? That can result in things not working out in his favor. Well, similarly, then it seems like what we're saying here is like, well, because of sin, and in particular because of the sin of adultery, it seems that there is an exception here as well. And so I think we have this broader framework of like, there's these general principles, but then there's sin that sort of gets in the way, and this is just one further application of that same framework.
That's true. And even if sometimes there's situations that are not dealing with sin, and there's still scriptural exceptions that are given. A great example of how Mark is a shorter, abbreviated gospel and Matthew is a longer one comes up with Mark 8:12. No sign shall be given to this generation, but in Matthew 12:39, no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. So it should not bother us or concern us if we see a shorter version in Mark 10 that lacks any exception, and then in Matthew, not just in one place, but in two places, we actually have that exception that is included.
So I would say that the difference here is that Jesus is giving a law, a moral rule regarding marriage, and a law like this really requires a degree of precision here. So if somebody only had Mark's gospel, they would think that if they divorced for adultery and remarried, that they should divorce the remarriage. So the general rule, with the exception, and Mark being a shortened version or accept the sign of Jonah, isn't the same kind of situation. And so again, this is not a defeater that the exception clause is only in Matthew and it's not in Mark and Luke, and so therefore the exception clause can't be referring to a valid marriage. So again, I don't think this is a defeater, and I actually rarely bring it up as a counter argument to the exception clause being for infidelity, because I just think there are like much stronger arguments against it being for infidelity in the exception clause. But it is a cause for discomfort. It does count against the innocent party to adultery view.
So if God permits a divorce, then by God's permission, they are no longer married. I just want that to sink in. If God permits a divorce, the persons are no longer married.
So I don't think this is quite right. Under the Mosaic law, divorce was permitted. It was tolerated, but it wasn't morally permissible. Now, I think what he means is if God says a divorce is morally permissible, then the people are unmarried, that he does in fact dissolve the marriage. And that I think he would say that Moses wasn't giving moral permission. And it's true, Moses didn't actually give moral permission. But here's what I would say. A person, I think, can separate and divorce if necessary, if they're retreating from an unsafe spouse for like abuse or something like that for against them or their kids. And so I would say the cause of that divorce is the unsafe spouse. I don't think that divorce then permits somebody to be able to remarry. So I think they'd be permitted to separate and divorce if necessary for safety, but then not able to remarry. So I can't totally agree with the statement that if divorce is permitted, therefore they're unmarried and remarriage is permitted. Now, I agree with Dr. Mays that if the exception clause did refer to infidelity, that divorce for the innocent party would dissolve the marriage. And we would know that because then the remarriage in that case would not be called adultery by Jesus. And so then by implication, the remarriage for the innocent party would then be a valid marriage.
Both divorces and remarries. It's not talking about different situations. Like if somebody divorces except for a situation of unchastity, or if somebody remarries. Now it's talking about one situation, one person who divorces and remarries. And the Lord then puts in the exception clause in there. So then that exception clause, even though the exception clause comes after the words divorces his wife. Okay, let's see. This is in, again, Matthew 19. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So even though the exception comes after the divorces part, nevertheless, this is talking about a single situation. And in that situation, the person who both divorces and remarries is not committing adultery.
Okay, so I agree with Dr. Mays here that this is talking about one situation there in Matthew 19:9. It's talking about a divorce and a remarriage. It's not talking about two separate situations where one has an exception and the other one does not have an exception. It's talking about one situation. And who he's addressing here are people who say that the exception clause permits divorce for infidelity, but does not permit remarriage. But grammatically, there's just no way to read Matthew 19:9 in that way. So I agree with him that in the exceptional situation, a person can remarry after a divorce. The question really is, what is the exceptional situation?
It also has to be kept in mind that that is what the Pharisees were asking about. They were asking about the situation of somebody who would divorce his wife and remarry. So, as I said, if somebody is no longer married, and this is so by God's permission, then to remarry would not be adultery. It's just the same as a widow. She's no longer married, and therefore, if she remarries, she is not committing adultery. So that is my basic argument for why the Lord does permit remarriage after a divorce for unchastity. But there is, this has been objected to by many scholars, especially of the more Roman Catholic leaning, as well as by evangelical and Lutheran scholars who are misled by those arguments. And I really do think that this comes from not really understanding what the Lord is doing when he is making these exceptions. But let's take a look at how they object and the way that I would respond to these. Okay, one of the exceptions comes from 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11. So 1 Corinthians 7 is where the Apostle Paul is dealing with a number of questions that had been sent to him by the Corinthian congregation or the Corinthian church. Probably was more than one congregation, but was a cluster of congregations. And in 10 and 11, he's dealing with this issue of not getting divorced. And he says, now to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. That is to say, he's not saying this just on his own, but he actually has the words of Jesus. He knows the words of Jesus. He knows what Jesus has said. And so he's repeating and reporting what Jesus has already said on this matter. Yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. And in 1 Corinthians, it's very clear that this departing also meant divorcing. In ancient Greco-Roman culture, and according to the Greco-Roman law, if one departed from the marital home with the intention of being divorced and staying away permanently, that was regarded in and of itself as being a legal divorce.
I agree that moving out was divorcing under Roman law.
When he says here, let her, a wife is not to depart from her husband, he also means she is not to divorce him. Not to depart from him and not to divorce him, because at that time they would both happen at the same time, according to that legal system. And then he goes on, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried. See, unmarried. So that was a divorce. Or be reconciled to her husband. And then he turns it around and says this applies also for the husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay, so notice what he says here. He says they are not supposed to divorce. In fact, it would be sin to divorce. But if they do divorce, they at least need to not get remarried. Okay, so, but what is sometimes noted here is they pay a lot of attention to verse 11. If she does depart, let her remain unmarried. And so the objection is that, okay, divorce might sometimes be permitted, but remarriage is never permitted. It just has to be kept in mind, though, that Paul does not say that in this situation the divorce was permitted. It's not. He says, let her not depart. And the husband is not to divorce, that is to say, send away his wife. So this is not actually talking about a permitted situation of divorce. It's talking about a forbidden situation of divorce. And in that forbidden situation of divorce, they are supposed to remain unmarried. That is to say, don't remarry. You are civilly unmarried. That is, according to human culture and society and law, you might be unmarried, but you are not supposed to do that. And so the way that the Lord Jesus talks about it in the Synoptic Gospels is that if they were to get remarried, it would be adultery. But this is not a situation of permitted divorce that he's talking about here. It's a situation of forbidden divorce. So, therefore, what St. Paul is talking about here is the exact same thing as what the Lord had been talking about in Matthew 5 and 19 and in Mark 10 and Luke 18. That is to say, if the Lord has forbidden the divorce and they get remarried, then that's not actually a remarriage. It's not actually marriage. It's actually fornication. It's actually adultery.
Okay, so this does not work. So Paul says she is not to depart, period. There's no exception for infidelity there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. So Dr. Mays has to assume his premise that there's an exception when the text rejects the idea of an exception. For 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, if that is all we had, we would think there is no exception for divorce and remarriage. There is no exception for infidelity. So you can't take 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11 and assume there is an exception intended in that text because it's a forbidden divorce. That doesn't work. But here's what I would say. The fact that Dr. Mays is trying to do that, who's trying to import the exception into a text that just does not have it in 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11, it shows you that it is uncomfortable that the exception is only in Matthew. And now again, as I said, this is not a defeater that it's only in Matthew and not in the other places, but it is a point against the exception clause, interpreting it for infidelity. Now, I want to notice this thing at the end. Dr. Mays calls the adulterous remarriage fornication, if you caught that. And that's actually my view of what the exception clause is, that a man married a divorced woman, for example, and so she's already married, and so the sex they have in that adulterous remarriage is also fornication. It's a fornication between the two of them because they're not married to each other, and Jesus explains that in Matthew 5:32b, where he's explaining the meaning of the word porneia in the exception clause.
Okay, so that's one point. Let's see. Because according to God, de jure divino, they are still married, then marrying somebody else would involve adultery. However, in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, God does permit a divorce. So that's different than the situation of 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11. So in those situations where God does permit a divorce, the people are no longer married in God's view. And by definition, adultery is not committed where marriage is absent. So that's my first response. My second response is this pre-Reformation, this Roman Catholic pre-Reformation view actually ends up defining divorce as permanent separation.
Okay, so does the Roman Catholic view treat divorce as permanent separation? Here, now again, I'm not Roman Catholic here, but he mentioned this, so I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. So I think they view it as a change in legal status, a divorce, and separation would be based on where people lived and not whether they were legally married. So again, I'm not Catholic, but I would say that the Catholic view seems to not care that much if you get a legal divorce. And I think that's wrong because Jesus says divorcing makes your spouse commit adultery in Matthew 5:32. Divorcing, like, it is a problem. Jesus does say not to separate what God has joined together, and divorce is a step of, pulling two people apart in their experience in their daily life. And so that's an issue. But also, the Catholics do think you can dissolve a natural marriage. They have 3 grounds for divorcing a natural marriage. Natural marriage is one where at least one of the spouses is an unbeliever. And the 3 grounds are the Pauline privilege, Petrine privilege, and they have a consummation one also. It's rarely used. So perhaps the question for a Roman Catholic canon lawyer would be whether a civil divorce is required when one of those 3 grounds for marriage dissolution is sought. And that's kind of a unusual question. I don't think I know the answer to that. They might say no. I don't actually know, but my guess is that's just pretty rare that there'd be a Roman Catholic dissolution, but not a legal divorce. It's kind of a strange combination. So I think really what Dr. Mays might be thinking about here is what is the mechanism for a dissolution of a marriage? So if you imagine a marriage can be dissolved prior to death, which I don't think it can be, so this is not really a question for me, but if you thought it was dissolvable before death, what is the mechanism for that dissolution? Do you think the church has to be involved? That's the Roman Catholic view. Or do you think like the state has to be involved? And I think that would be Dr. Mays's view that if somebody was the innocent party to adultery, that if they wanted to be unmarried so that they could go marry somebody else, they'd have to get a legal divorce. So it'd just be a question of the mechanism. Now, this is not an issue for me because I don't think a marriage can be dissolved prior to death. So this is really an issue between him and the Catholic Church. It's not an issue that comes up with my view.
And they treat the marriage bond as though it still persists. But in Matthew 5:32, 19:9, Mark 10:11 to 12, and Luke 16:18, remarriage is forbidden because the divorce was against God's will. So what kind of divorce is actually permitted in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9? If you're holding to the Roman Catholic view, you're kind of forced to say that it would have to be a divorce that is contrary to God's permissive will, and yet somehow is still permitted by God. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Also, the Pharisees asked about the kind of divorce that allows remarriage, and Jesus did not define what divorce is. He didn't redefine divorce and say, actually, it's not really divorce. The marriage bond still exists. It's just permanent separation. He didn't say that. Instead, what he did is he limited what a permissible divorce is to almost nothing. So he limited a permissible divorce. He did not redefine divorce.
So I do think Jesus was teaching them a different understanding of divorce than what the Pharisees had. The Pharisees thought a divorce of a valid marriage meant the dissolution of that marriage. But by calling remarriage adultery, Jesus said divorce is merely a change in legal status, not an actual dissolution of a marriage. So in that sense, he was telling them that their whole understanding of what divorce does is just incorrect. Now, if you think infidelity permits divorce and remarriage, then you would still say Jesus was operating on a different definition of divorce, because you would say that divorce itself does not dissolve a marriage. You would say that divorce plus being a certain kind of victim dissolves a marriage, and that kind of victim would be somebody who was cheated on. But divorce itself does not dissolve a marriage. So no matter how you slice it, there's just no way Jesus and the Pharisees thought of divorce in the same way. Jesus did not think divorce by itself dissolved a marriage. I would say divorce doesn't dissolve a marriage ever, but if you believed in the innocent party to adultery view, you'd say that divorce plus being a victim of being cheated on would be both necessary. So in either case, neither myself nor Dr. Mays is really operating on the Pharisees' definition and understanding of what divorce does and how it works.
Also, the pre-Reformation view, which defines divorce merely as permission to separate, but keeps the marriage bond intact, if they were consistent, they would not allow separation for any cause except for unchastity, not even for violence. Keep in mind, what did the Lord say was the only reason for divorce, and that was unchastity. And they are defining divorce as permanent separation. So by that logic, the only reason for separation would be unchastity, not violence. So that too doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it's also not how they practice.
So the reason why I would say that safety permits separation, and if necessary to get a legal divorce in order to be safe, is that the safety problem is analogous to abandonment. And so I would say it's included in the phrase "in such cases" in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 15. I have a whole video on that if you're interested in that question. But basically the idea is Paul is saying that if you're abandoned by your spouse, that you're, quote, not enslaved now, which means you don't have to worry about the practical encumbrances of that marriage. And now you have more freedom, you have more time and all that. So now you can use that and devote your time and service to the Lord. So you're not enslaved. But he says in there that in such cases, so not only abandonment, but in analogous kind of situations, an abuse, a safety problem would be an analogous situation because they're causing the person to retreat. And so really the person who's creating the unsafe environment in that sense is analogous to an abandoner. And so it would fall under the "in such cases" phrase. "In such cases" is in the plural. And so the idea is there is more than one case that's being talked about there. And Wayne Grudem has done great work where he's researched this phrase "in such cases." And it definitely is talking about things that are analogous, not just the one case mentioned as a kind of a concrete example in the text. But I do think it has to be like tightly analogous to the example that's given. And the example that's given is abandonment. And forcing somebody to retreat is effectively the same thing as abandoning the person.
Also, that pre-Reformation view, that Roman Catholic view, has historically been very strict against remarriage, but historically has been very lenient on divorce because divorce was just seen as separation. But keep in mind, it was especially divorce that the Lord so strictly prohibited when he said, "What God has joined together, let not man separate." Okay, so that's why I do not believe that the objection from 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11 stands up, and I think we can set that one aside. Another objection comes from saying that what that exception clause in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, only in 19:9, that the exception clause in Matthew 19:9 only applies to the divorcing part because of where it comes in the passage. So whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another. Okay, so the exception follows divorces his wife. And so therefore it's thought, therefore the exception only deals with divorcing. It does not permit any remarrying. But what that does is it actually makes the grammar a little bit difficult. In Matthew 19:9, he says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. I've already made the point that it's one situation, but you would actually have to take this as two different situations according to this argument. So if the exception only applies to the divorcing part, you would have this situation where the adultery would mean, okay, you would have to read it something like this. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality is committing adultery, and whoever marries another is committing adultery. You'd have to use the same committing adultery to describe both situations. But in that first situation, if somebody, for example, divorces wrongly but does not remarry, just divorces, and maybe he's just going to live singly, he's going to be a monk after that, that is not adultery in the literal sense. And so the proponents of this view would have to say that it is like adultery here would mean like a spiritual kind of adultery. That is to say, a grievous sin against the marriage. But then in the second situation, remarrying another, well, that would be literal adultery. Okay, so that's kind of a problem. You would have the exact same words, commits adultery, meaning two different things at the exact same time in the exact same verse. He who divorces his wife, except for a case of unchastity, commits adultery spiritually or metaphorically, that is, he sins. And he who marries another commits adultery literally, that is, he has intercourse with somebody who's not really his wife. And yet, a single word cannot mean two different things at the same time. So the only other way that you could do it is to say that adultery here is never meant in the literal sense, that it only is meant in the spiritual sense of a grievous sin against the marriage, but not literally having sexual intercourse with somebody who's not your wife. But if that's the way they go, and there's no reason from the text to make you take it that way, then it's clear that they are departing from the literal sense of the text.
Extremely well said there by Dr. Mays. That was very eloquent. But there is a problem. The problem is this. Dr. Mays has the same problem with his view. And here's how that would work. If a husband and wife are married, and let's say the wife cheats and the husband divorces, Dr. Mays, in another video we have, he says that now they're unmarried. Now they're both unmarried. That's why the husband can go ahead and marry somebody else, because they're unmarried now. That wouldn't be adultery. But that also means that the guilty party is unmarried. But if the guilty party were to go remarry, let's say the husband wants her back, but she goes ahead and she remarries, Dr. Mays would say that's adultery. But wait, she's unmarried and committing adultery? How is that possible? That means the word adultery has to mean something other than the normal meaning of the word adultery. The normal case would be they're married, they divorce for irreconcilable differences, and then she goes and marries another guy. That's adultery because she's a married person remarrying with somebody else, having sex with another guy. It's a violation of the marriage because she's married. But in the guilty party to adultery scenario, where the person is a guilty party to adultery, they divorce, now they're unmarried, and they marry somebody else, that's a different kind of adultery. So he's got the same problem with the word adultery, meaning two different things at the same time. And in the case where it's the guilty party who's remarrying, the violation seems to be a violation of the right of the innocent party to have them back, that they have like this possession right. He talks about like where divorce is like theft and remarriage and all is like theft. So it's like this possession right that's being violated as opposed to the marriage being violated, the marriage bond being violated. So he's got adultery having two different meanings at the same time, which is not possible. This is, in fact, something that you find after you do enough research and you listen to enough arguments about divorce and remarriage. whenever somebody has to end up having a word mean two different things at the same time, that's a signal to you something is critically wrong with that view. Here's another example where you see that in the people who have the betrothal view of the exception clause. They would say that a husband and wife are betrothed, and let's say she cheats on him during the betrothal and he divorces her. He's divorcing her for fornication, and then he can go ahead and he can remarry. So that's what the exception clause means in the exceptional scenario. But in the remarriage scenario, it's adultery. In that case, he's not divorcing a betrothal, he's divorcing a marriage. But what that imagines is that the word wife in Matthew 19:9 has two meanings at the same time. In the exceptional situation, it means only betrothed woman, and in the remarriage situation, it means only married woman. And so you can't have the word wife have those two meanings at the same time. I agree the word wife can refer to a betrothed woman, and the word wife can refer to a married woman. But the word wife can't refer to only a betrothed woman and only a married woman at the same time. That doesn't work. And so his example here also about how the exception clause would only apply to the divorce and not the remarriage is another example of how the word adultery would have to have two different meanings. Divorcing is adultery, which doesn't make any sense, or that the remarriage is adultery. So the remarriage being adultery, that makes sense. But the divorcing being adultery, nobody even had sex. It doesn't make any sense at all. So you have to imagine the word adultery has two different meanings at the same time there, and that is a defeater for that view. But it's also a defeater for the innocent party to adultery view, because it imagines that the guilty party to adultery who divorces and remarries commits adultery even though they're not married. And that means the word adultery has to have two different meanings at the same time. That is not possible.
It is actually interesting. I'll just point this out before we move on too much, that the placement of the exception is exactly perfect. The reason why somebody would divorce his wife or a woman would divorce her husband is because he or she, the other party, has committed adultery. That is the reason why somebody would get a divorce. Then the next part, why would one remarry? The reason why one would remarry is because one is not married. So actually the placement really needs to be right where it is in order for it to make sense. And yet that situation still brings about a situation where the Lord has permitted the divorce, so that in this single situation of somebody who both divorces and remarries, it is not adultery.
Okay, so this thing about the placement of the exception clause in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, you have the divorce, then you have the exception, and then you have the remarriage. People make a lot of hay out of the placement of the exception clause. I don't think it really matters that much where the exception clause is going to be. That's just not going to tell you what Jesus meant in the exceptional scenario. People write books on the location of the exception clause, whole chapters. I just don't think it matters. From everything I've read, I don't think it matters at all. You could put it before or after, or in the middle, or whatever, any part in the verse, it's going to mean the same thing.
Okay. So now another objection comes from Matthew 5:32. So Matthew 5:32 has this unusual statement. It seems unusual and seems kind of strange to a lot of interpreters, because it says, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality to commit adultery. What's that all about?
Okay, so Matthew 5:31, the verse before the one he just quoted, is paraphrasing Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. So Jesus says, you have heard it was said, if you want a divorce, give your wife a certificate of divorce, right? That's basically what he says in Matthew 5:31. If you want a divorce, give her a certificate of divorce. And that's what Moses was writing in Deuteronomy 24:1, that if man finds a matter of uncleanness, he hands her a certificate of divorce, sends her out of the house. Okay. So Jesus is just paraphrasing Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. This is the text the Pharisees go to. This is where they start when they're talking about divorce and remarriage. They're trying to figure out what's permissible. Okay. So then when Jesus says divorce and remarriage causes her to commit adultery in Matthew 5:32, Jesus is still referencing Deuteronomy 24. In Deuteronomy 24 verse 4, Moses wrote that a woman has been defiled by her second marriage. So it says, after that she has been defiled. I understand that to mean the first man divorced her, she remarried, and that remarriage defiled her. After that, she has been defiled. Now notice, Jesus says, makes her commit adultery. So who is it that's made to commit adultery? It's the woman, is the one who's being made to commit adultery. And then in Deuteronomy, who's the one who's defiled? The woman. Also notice, who is being acted upon, right? In both cases, somebody is being acted upon. In Matthew 5:32, the one who's being acted upon, made to commit adultery, is the woman. She's like almost passive here. And in Deuteronomy 24, verse 4, she's been defiled. Somebody else did something to her, almost passive there, and the man was the one who did it to her. In Matthew 5:32, Jesus says, makes her commit adultery. In Deuteronomy 24:4, Moses writes, after that she has been defiled. So it's a very close pattern there that you see between Matthew 5:32 and Deuteronomy 24:4. So that's why I think Jesus says it that way. What he's doing is he's referencing back to Deuteronomy 24, and he's trying to show people, listen, there's a part in this law that you guys are not paying attention to. So even if you go to Deuteronomy 24, the place where Moses gave you an allowance to divorce for your hardness of heart, if you look closely in there, there is the kernel of the true moral law there. And the kernel of the true moral law is divorce and remarriage is adultery. After that, she has been defiled. And so Jesus tells them, here's what that means. You've been reading the verse, but you haven't been understanding it. It says she committed adultery in that remarriage there. And so what that means is the man who divorced her, he is making her commit adultery. He is culpable for her adultery. So you guys want a divorce? You're going to be making her commit adultery. Now that's different from Matthew chapter 19. There, Jesus does what the Damascus document appears to do, and it draws from Genesis to show the real moral law on marriage. And so that's the reason for the unusual phrasing in Matthew 5:32, causes her to commit adultery. That's from Deuteronomy 24:4. And then in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is drawing from Genesis. You'll also notice in Matthew 5:32, who is it that is being caused to commit adultery there? It's talking about the woman in Matthew 5:32. And so Jesus is able to draw from Deuteronomy 24:4 to make that connection. But that's a little bit harder a connection to make when you're talking about the man remarrying. In Matthew 19:9, it's the man being imagined to remarry. So in order to do that, it's kind of hard to do that from Deuteronomy 24:4, but you can do it from Genesis. In the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, two were made one. Don't separate it. If you divorce and remarry, it's adultery. You can see that from the design found in creation. That's the reason for the different phrasing there in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. Jesus is showing the true moral law from two different texts in the Old Testament. It's a brilliant case study on how Jesus uses the law to show the true moral law that he's bringing forward. He's bringing out from the Mosaic law the perfections of the law and God's character for us to follow in the New Testament.
A woman. And then after that, also, he says, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced, who has been divorced, commits adultery. Okay, so if she has been divorced, why can she not get remarried? But a husband who divorces an adulteress, he can. And that doesn't make sense. So that's kind of their argument. Why is that exception not extended to marrying a divorced woman? Okay, the response is, first of all, in Matthew 5:32b, it is the general rule. Whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. That's generally the case. Matthew 5:32a is the exception. That is to say, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. Okay, so we've got different situations, one which is the general rule and the other which includes that exception. Now, the second one here is that it's still strange that it says makes her to commit adultery, and one who has been divorced, whoever marries her is committing adultery. Like, isn't she abandoned? She has been divorced, so maybe it sounds like she has been abandoned. And it doesn't make sense here to a lot of readers. But what we have to keep in mind here is that the woman is not declared innocent here. That's not what's being talked about. Under Jewish law, women could not instigate or file for divorce. So in that context, in that culture, being divorced by a husband did not imply either innocence or guilt. It's just a general situation. That's the general way that you would talk about a woman who has gone through a divorce. She has been divorced by her husband. Now, it is interesting that in Mark, which was written to most likely to a Greco-Roman context, the Lord's words are recorded that make it clear that a woman also who divorces her husband would be committing adultery if she remarried. So, but in Matthew, which has these kind of seemingly strange statements about the divorced woman and anybody that marries her is committing adultery, or the man who divorces his wife would be causing her to commit adultery. What that's saying is that in normal situations, unless the exception applies, marrying a divorced woman would involve adultery. And when it says makes her to commit adultery, the implied addition that you have to say there is if she were to remarry, which was often the case. Usually people, if they were divorced, would remarry. So what he's saying there is that if this is a wrongful divorce, a divorce that God has not allowed, and in Jewish context, it's always going to be the man that's going to legally instigate that and bring that about. What he's actually doing is he's putting the wife in a situation where if she remarries, she will be committing adultery. So that is the resolution to this objection about Matthew 5:32.
So I don't really think this solves Dr. May's concern here. So if a husband and wife are married and there's no infidelity, and the man divorces her, and then she marries somebody else, that's adultery. But in that scenario, she's been abandoned. Now, I understand he said there can be a case where a man divorces his wife and like she's not innocent. What Jesus is saying in Matthew 5:32b is that a man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. That's all cases, whether she's been abandoned or not. There's no like, unless, assuming she was the one who really caused the divorce, there's none of that going on in Matthew 5:32b. It's just a flat statement. So there's no way any of Jesus' hearers could be understanding some kind of way to make a distinction between, well, a divorce where like really she was at fault for the divorce and not him, even though he gave her the divorce. Like there's no way for them to make the distinction that Dr. Mays is importing from his reading, I believe, of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 15. I think he's trying to import that into Matthew 5:32b, and there's just nothing there that says that. You can't import that. So there is no exception for abandonment found in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, or Luke 16.
Another objection comes from a typological relationship, or the analogy of Christ and the church. So this is in Ephesians 5:31 to 32. And it's worth reading. It's a wonderful passage, very comforting, and talks about this wonderful benefit that we have in our union with Christ, but also says something about the mystery of being married as well. So he says, for we are members, he's been talking about the duties of husbands and wives. And he says, for we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones, talking about our relationship as believers with Christ. Verse 31, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. So the Apostle Paul brings up this relationship of husband and wife and shows that it is parallel to the relationship of Christ and the church. There's some sort of analogy here. Maybe our human marriages are a type of the relationship of Christ and the church. There's some sort of a mystery that's hidden here. So then, it is argued then that because there is this relationship, and we know that God is faithful to his promises and he will never abandon his church, that even if she were to commit adultery spiritually, if she were to repent later on, he would welcome his church back. Likewise, individual believers. If an individual believer commits spiritual fornication by falling into false belief, despair, and other great shame and vice, or committing idolatry, if that person repents of his or her idolatry and returns to the Lord in repentance and faith, the Lord will receive her back into that one-time marriage that they had previously. So they would take this example of the Lord with his church and say, that's how it has to be with human marriage as well. Therefore, if there has been a divorce, there can never be any remarriage. Rather, that husband has to simply wait for his fornicating wife to cease her fornication and come back. or that woman who has a husband who just gets tired of her and divorces her and runs off and marries somebody else. She just has to wait for him to come back, and maybe he never will. So that is the argument. And here's my response to that. First of all, analogies are not identical to their reference. That is to say, yes, there is an analogy between human marriage and the relationship of Christ and the church, but that doesn't mean they're identical in every way. We really have to let Scripture guide the way in which we see this relationship and this analogy. In fact, there are going to be discontinuities between the two parts of any analogy. Every typology cannot be identical in all of its details, or else both would be identical. So, for example, you've got the crossing of the Red Sea, and that's a type of baptism, where it's an analogy with holy baptism. And yet it can't be exactly the same in all details, or else there would be no difference. So there are going to be differences between these. One reason, or one way in which human marriage is different from the marriage between Christ and the church is that human marriage is ended by death. And the union of Christ and the church is not ended by death. So that's a discontinuity. Also, when we look at God's relationship with his people in the Old Testament and how that then comes into the New Testament, it is clear that God rejected Jews, his ancient people, not all Jews, but he rejected those Jews who had rejected Jesus as the Christ. And he joined Gentiles to the church. So there are a part of God's Old Testament church, in fact, the majority, we might say, I'm not sure if we can say that or not, who have been rejected and essentially divorced by God, and in their place, he has added the Gentiles. So that actually is at least pointing to a little bit more complexity in God's relationship with his people than simply to say that a husband and wife can, no matter what the situation, if it's a divorce that God permits, they can never remarry. That analogy does not actually hold up, and there is some indications that God divorces and rejects his idolatrous people in the Old Testament. And likewise, even in the New Testament, if you look at Revelation 2:5, there's a threat there that God is going to remove the lampstand of those churches that are unfaithful to him. That would be essentially a spiritual divorce. Okay, so this is an important analogy. There is an important analogy between Christ and the church, but that should not be used to overrule the clear exception passages in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9.
All right, a few things I want to say here. First, I think it is great how Dr. Mays presents objections. I think he does a fair job representing the objection. And then he does that, and then he says, all right, now here's my response to it. It's very clear. He also does it in a very honest way. He doesn't do a straw man, as far as I can tell. So I think that's great. It's refreshing in some ways. I also agree with him that analogies are not the way to reason about this. You want to go to the text that clearly talk about it and not to analogies. Jeremiah chapter 3, for example, can't be taken as a seminar on marriage, because then it would be permissible for a pastor today to be married to two sisters in violation of Leviticus 18 and 1 Timothy chapter 3. But people try to go to Jeremiah chapter 3 and say, see, therefore we can divorce and remarry. Okay, can you also be married to two sisters and be a pastor? No, you can't. So that doesn't really work there. You have to read analogies. You have to figure out, what is the author who's using this analogy? What are they trying to say? What's the point they're trying to make? And then find the way in which the analogy supports that point, and not take their analogy over off into left field and something that they're not talking about, something they're not intending to speak about. So you want the analogy to be used to talk only about the thing that the author intended and not try to expand their analogy beyond the authorial intent. So I totally agree with Dr. Mays here. And yes, you could find different analogies and then you could take the ball and run with it and go score a touchdown. People try to do that all the time, kind of on both sides of this. And you can take Ephesians 5, you can take Jeremiah 3, and people are going to argue about analogies. Just go to the text that clearly talks about it instead of going to analogies that weren't designed to be a seminar on marriage, divorce, and remarriage.
Perhaps one of the main arguments is simply to look at the exegesis of various early church fathers, and then to say, well, the early church fathers explained these passages in this way, namely that there can be no remarriage. And it seems to many people that just completely unthinkable that the early church fathers would have misunderstood the Greek New Testament. They spoke Greek after all. How could they possibly misunderstand it? Or they were close to the times of the apostles, so therefore their understanding of the texts was probably right. This is a serious objection and one that needs to be discussed. So we're talking about the ante-Nicene fathers, that is to say, the fathers of the church before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. These include people like, or rather documents and people like the Shepherd of Hermas, Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Theophilus of Antioch, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Novatian, Lactantius, and others. Andrew Doss's book on remarriage in early Christianity, his chapter 6 includes the whole argument, and he has a lot of detail there. But I disagree that what he is setting forth there represents the entire early church. For example, he notes, and rightly so, that the response of the church fathers after the Council of Nicaea to this question about remarriage is complex. And in fact, there's an interesting, let's see if I can find it. I can't find it right now, but a French scholar by the name of Cruzel, in an encyclopedia of early Christianity that was edited in part by Joel Olowski, and Olowski told me about this. There's an article in there on divorce, and it's interesting that the response to and the understanding of these passages after the Council of Nicaea, you had some of the early church fathers, such as Ambrosiaster in his exegesis of the Pauline epistles, where, for example, he takes 1 Corinthians 7:15 in a way that is similar to the Lutheran view, namely that it permits remarriage after an abandonment situation. So anyway, it is a more complicated situation after you get past the Council of Nicaea. Some are more strict, some are more in the Lutheran frame of mind. But Doss has the whole approach, has the whole argument from the ante-Nicene fathers, and so this needs to be considered.
Okay, so I think we need to make sure we're asking the right question here. I don't think the question is just who can do better interpretation, the reformers or the early church. Rather, it's a question of whether or not the early church's overwhelming voice in one direction is an echo of the apostles. An echo is evidence, not just interpretation. And that's why people can kind of sense, well, if all the early church thought this, maybe they had a point. Because people can sense, that's a kind of imperfect evidence. So take for example, Menno Simons. Let's say you had the complete writings of Menno Simons. He was a Catholic priest who left the Catholicism, and then he went around and tried to reform all of the Anabaptists, and he was the founder basically of the Mennonites, and then the Amish broke off from them. So let's say you're reading Menno Simons' writings and you're wondering, did Menno Simons, did he really believe in shunning? He wrote this and he wrote that, but maybe there's a question. Well, one thing you could do is you could look at the followers of Menno Simons thereafter, and for hundreds of years they're shunning and shunning and shunning in these various different situations. And I'm not saying that they're right or wrong there about that. Well, my point is, if you want to figure out what did Menno Simons think, a piece of evidence you could use is what did his followers think he meant for hundreds of years. And if they all pretty much thought the same thing, pretty good chance that's what the leader thought. So if the leader, Jesus, thought divorce and remarriage was adultery, and that there was really no exception that permitted remarriage after divorce, if that's what Jesus believed, and the disciples, the apostles, understood that, and then the early church thought that for hundreds of years, that would make you think, oh, that's an echo that came from what Jesus originally taught. So that's why it's a powerful thing. Now, here is going to be a problem. Dr. Mays, his view does not conform to the early church view. My view doesn't totally conform to the early church view. Mine is a little bit different because the early church would say you could divorce for adultery, but you could not remarry. And I would say that you cannot divorce for adultery. Jesus specifically rejected divorce for adultery in Matthew 19:8. So you can't divorce for adultery. But what I would say is that the exception clause is referring to a man who married a divorced woman, and so she's an already married person, so that's an invalid marriage. And you do see that in the writings of Clement of Alexandria, and you do see other people, Irenaeus and Basil the Great, referring to an adulterous remarriage, the sex in that marriage, as fornication. Irenaeus says that, and so does Basil the Great. It's not certain that they are connecting that idea, though, to the exception clause, but you can tell that they believe that fornication is a Greek word that would be used for sex in an invalid remarriage. And then Tertullian also uses the word fornication to refer to sex in a remarriage, but that's in a context talking about a widow remarrying, so it's a little bit more dubious, but the other three are pretty strong. But generally, it is true that my view is not, of the exception clause, is not really strongly found in the early church. So I agree with that. And so how would I explain that? The Shepherd of Hermas was a writing that had a lot of credibility, too much credibility, I would say, and in there is a vision that the writer claimed to have. God told him basically, you can divorce for adultery, but I can't remarry, basically. And so that writing of the Shepherd of Hermas was highly influential before they kind of totally formalized the canon. And so I think that's where they got it from. There's no evidence of that, kind of one way or the other, but it is a pretty strong explanation. If trying to harmonize that with the exception clause, that would explain why they would say the exception clause allows somebody to divorce for adultery, even though Origen said it's a kind of an irrational rule, and even though it doesn't really make grammatical sense with Matthew 19:9, as Dr. Mays very clearly laid out here, whatever you can divorce for, you can remarry for. And I totally agree with him. There's no other way to read Matthew 19:9. That's not a problem for my view, because my view is it's an invalid marriage. So it is an interesting question about the role of the early church. What do we do with this evidence? And I do think you have to have an explanation
about how to answer this. My answers go like this. Okay, it is true that pretty much all of the testimonies that we have, if they deal with this issue, are of the strict no remarriage view, coming from those various fathers that are mentioned here: Shepherd of Hermas, Justin Martyr, etc. But that doesn't mean that it's right. The Greek fathers knew Greek very well, but they did not know the Jewish context well. Likewise, to say that this is the position of all of the early church fathers before the Council of Nicaea, rather, it's all we can say is that this is the position of the early church fathers' writings that have been preserved. Okay, so
when you look at all of the councils that we have, all the regional councils that we have, every time they had a canon about divorce and remarriage, they would deny the remarried person communion for the rest of their life. And these regional councils had like a ton of church leaders who were there. So the idea that, well, it's only the extant writings, I mean, it is definitely the overwhelming voice of the church.
We can't make a historical categorical argument. Now, I do think that we can make an inductive argument to say, hey, we've got so many testimonies that are saying this thing, therefore it's highly likely that this was the standard teaching. Okay, that's fine. We can certainly say that, at least of the folks that the documents that we have going back to the Shepherd of Hermas. But many of these fathers who write many excellent things also are including some non-biblical ascetic views. By ascetic, I mean strict discipline. For example, Tertullian and Athenagoras taught that it is sinful for widows to remarry. They taught that it is sinful for widows to remarry. That is clearly not a biblical opinion.
So I just think we have to make a distinction between here's a guy who made a mistake over here. Therefore, we have to throw out the voice of the whole early church. I'm not saying he's not saying throw out, but you have a very clear voice on one direction, and then you have a guy who has a wrong view about widows, or a guy over here who has this wrong view over there. That is not; those are just categorically not the same thing. So I don't think you can say because Tertullian was wrong about widows, therefore the whole early church's view was incorrect. I think that's just not an argument that can be made.
That's what the scriptures say. And so, should we really think that they are not influenced by non-biblical ascetic views? Well, we have evidence that some of them were. Certainly, at least Tertullian and Athenagoras were influenced by non-biblical ascetic views. Okay, so besides that, I would also point out, as I mentioned, the post-Nicene diversity, but we should also recognize that some of these ancient Christian writers did have some incorrect opinions on some matters. We still look at them as fathers in the faith. They taught many things, maybe even most things that were right, but we still have to compare what their writings say with the Holy Scriptures, and let the Scriptures be the judge, not just of us, but also of them. So, for example, the Shepherd of Hermas allows only one repentance. And later early church fathers made clear that no, it is possible to repent more than once and be forgiven more than once. Novatian denied forgiveness to repentant apostates. So if somebody had fallen away from the faith in persecution, could never be restored to forgiveness. Tertullian became a Montanist, that is a kind of charismatic sectarian, a follower of various prophetesses. And as I mentioned, he forbade remarriage to widows. Justin Martyr taught the essential subordination of the Son to the Father and denied God's omnipresence. Origen taught the pre-existence of souls, universal restoration, and the succession of worlds. So, look, we recognize that these early church fathers are fathers in the faith. They have much good to teach us, but we should not expect them to be inerrant on everything. And so we recognize that they are wrong on these points of doctrine. We should also recognize that they are wrong on their understanding of Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9.
Yeah, so I just don't think that saying a choir member was wrong on this tune or a choir member was wrong on that tune is the same thing as saying the entire choir was off tune there. So they definitely had a very strong disfavor toward remarriage, and they did not think that there were any exceptions that permitted somebody to be able to divorce and remarry. And that just seems like a very strong echo. Now, and I agree. I don't think they got the exception clause right, but I mean, when you have the New Testament and you have the logic of Jesus' argument, they're very strong. He's going back to the garden. There'd be no divorce and no remarriage in the garden for any reason whatsoever. And then you have like all of these different challenges with the adultery view that we talked about before, the Schrodinger's marriage problem. Jesus appears to specifically reject divorce for adultery in Matthew 19:7 and 8. It just seems like that they had it right, that there's no remarriages after divorce. Now, again, my view is not really dependent on the early church view. I actually rarely bring that up. So I'm very grateful for Dr. May's work on all this. Now, on this episode, there's a lot of differences that I have with Dr. May's, but I just want to take this whole thing back and look at the overall context. I think he's very honest when he's talking about these different issues. Very smart guy, and I'm looking forward to getting his book. And I think it's great that he, as a seminary professor, Dr. Benjamin Mays of the Missouri Synod Lutheran denomination, that he is saying, actually, hey guys, there are some adulterous remarriages that need to be divorced. We need to take a look at this seriously. And he's actually bringing out that in the Lutheran denomination, in their history, in their heritage, their theologians were saying this. This is part of Lutheranism, that some adulterous remarriages must be divorced. And so I'm grateful for his contribution to all of that. And I hope a lot of people do check out his book. Also get my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. That's on Amazon.com. I have a link to all of that below. Thank you, Javier Perdomo, for having Dr. Mays on there. And so guys, go check out Javier's YouTube channel and make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. And I will see you guys next time.